The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Managing ESI and Control Risk and Liability webinar. Today's special guest is Greg Buckles, who is the co-founder of EDJ Group and is an independent eDiscovery consultant and analyst specializing in enterprise technology and workflow solutions, with over 24 years in discovery and consulting. He has published research papers on many different aspects of electronic discovery, enterprise search, and corporate defensibility. This webinar will also be hosted by Jim McGann. Jim is the Vice President of Marketing at Index Engines. His extensive experience with eDiscovery and information management in the Fortune 2000 sector. He is a frequent writer and speaker on the topic of big data, backup tape remediation, electronic discovery, and records management. Please type any questions for Jim or Greg in the question area on the right of your screen, and they will answer them at the end of the webinar. So let's begin. Greg?
Thank you, Jan. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. This topic is a relatively new one to many corporate and law firms. The EDJ Group conducts active research combined with ongoing strategic consulting engagements with large corporations, law firms, and small and mid-sized businesses as well when their needs and their requirements and engagements coincide with our research agenda. Data profiling, or more specifically visibility into large pools of unstructured data, has been a pretty hot topic on our research area for about the last year to 2 years. So I was glad to take this opportunity to put together some material from our recent surveys and to get a chance to share what we've seen in the market, some of the approaches, some of the strategies, and some of the trends that we're seeing. Talk a little bit about the current data environment. Basically, what do we see out there? What are people saying that how they're dealing with the large quantities of data? Cover a little bit about the functionality and the requirements, the technologies for generating data about data that reside in these large unstructured shares. Dig into a little bit more of the case studies, properly anonymized, but talk a little bit about areas where we've seen folks who have tackled these large defensible data deletion initiatives, PST eliminations, tape remediations, other areas where they've been holding data for anywhere. Most corporations have been holding since 2004 through 2006 when the Federal Civil Procedure first came in, and now they're looking back at these large data dumps and trying to figure out how to get by them. And then we will move over to let Jim give a little bit of example of how Index Engines has tackled this problem, how their technology can look at these large data collections, whether they're on tape, active file shares, SharePoint, other locations, generate out those profiles or data about the data so that decisions can actually be made and these initiatives can move forward. We'll get into some more in-depth examples and details of how to leverage profiles to apply classifications, to apply actions, and really what it takes to get started in one of these initiatives to have concrete goals that you can move forward on. If you'll hold up 1 second. Jan, if you can, I think that you just tried to pass the screen share to me, and what we want to do is share out the presentation or give me control if you can. Or you can keep control and just keep advancing. One of the two. There you go. We're getting it back? Great. Thanks. So let's first talk about the problem. All of us have seen articles, discussion about what they're calling big data. Many providers out there are trying to say that there is a lot of value in these large quantities of corporate client information. One of the problems that we see on the eDiscovery side is the downside of the big data, which means there's too much. And without having a system which is controlling that data, categorizing that data, disposing of that data without being able to see what you've accumulated, then the data itself can actively grow faster than not. I think it's pretty obvious in our survey we saw, that most people believed, vast majority, that they had to put some kind of defensible deletion of information in place because they couldn't control the growth otherwise. If we can advance, and look at what kind of projects. So what kind of projects are we seeing happen? More than 2 years ago, in our consulting practice, we would not have seen nearly as many large corporations or customers. We did not see many who were willing to move forward, where corporate legal was willing to sign off with a process and say, this is defensible, and yes, we're okay with deleting it. I think that the rapid growth, and we're seeing surveys out there that are saying that corporate data per user is growing at anywhere up to 40, even 50% rate per year. Without that kind of growth and control, you can't keep and manage that data. The shared drives are one of the obvious choices because that type of unstructured native file share, whether it's on a great big SAN, NAS, or other storage device, or whether it's on traditional direct-attached storage, is relatively high cost per volume. It's still treated as a tier 1 or high-tier storage for backup, for recovery. The cost per gig is very large. Even those companies which are moving their data to the cloud are still seeing it grow out of control, and the costs still add up. The problem is that the first step usually in being able to reduce or manage that data is not to try to, take your existing retention policy and apply it without looking at the data. Instead, the first part of the process is to need to understand what kinds of data in there, how old is it, who owns it, where did it come from, and before legal can be comfortable that they're ready for MIS and the users and records management to start cleaning up, removing, expiring, migrating, or otherwise changing that data, they need to know that the data that's potentially underneath of legal hold is protected at that point, that they've met their preservation obligation. That's why 2 of the largest initiatives that we saw in our survey were basically to clean up that network share and to get that legal hold in place, because I think they're codependent. You can't clean up on one side without getting it in there. So, Jan, if you move to the next. Because the data is not all just junk. There's a lot of it that's junk, and Jim, I think you and I talked recently about the percentages that we're hearing back from various initiatives and various providers out there of how much they think is junk or non-records or non-critical, non-business related data. I know I see a pretty wide range of variance depending upon the type of business that a client is engaged in, specific business unit, how long they've been around, where the data is residing, and how many M&A activities they've had that have come through. I know, Jim, we were talking earlier that you've heard people come back and tell you that as little as 5 to 7% are real corporate records. I've typically seen more averaging out more around that 25 to 30% on there.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen, like you said, I think the more important issue is, what type of work are they doing? If it's heavy research data, pharmaceutical research or oil and gas research, then that data has significant value because it's research data. If it's, other department that's maybe most extreme, like a mailroom or something like that, then their data has less value to the business. So I think it's, what the nice thing about data profiling is it allows you to be very segmented in what you're looking at and get a quick look at it and kind of tap into some of the metadata fields like, when was it accessed? Not that access time is an indicator of the value, but it gives you a quick read on what's there.
Well, exactly, and even within a company, I've seen a great deal of variation between the level of value in data. For instance, engage with large oil and gas companies. When you go into the engineering department, their file shares tend to have a much higher percentage of high-value data. So they've got a lot of SharePoint, they've got a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of diagrams, CAD, calculations, reports, and yet when you start moving down into other business units that are more involved in, say, transportation or outreach, marketing, and those areas, we see a much higher level of non-business content that is stacked. So we've got all kinds of variation on there. But I think the main key, and if we can just go forward, is that you have to see the data and to look at the data in order to make intelligent decisions about it. And trying to come up with a plan on how to tackle the data is one of those things that you have to get the information first in order to be able to make good, cognizant decisions. So, one more, Jan? The first step that we talk about here is looking at profiling in place. So before we start doing polls, and this is especially critical on eDiscovery because the data profiling, we might look at it for large information governance initiatives. It's even more critical in eDiscovery activities when we start looking at preservation, we start looking at collections. The more we understand about the data in place, whether it's in SharePoint servers, whether it's on large tape collections, whether it's inside or contained in with large enterprise content management systems, all these areas are ones that if you try to make up your mind what's related to that case or what's valuable to the company before you know what data is there, you're essentially guessing on there. More importantly now, when we start having global corporations that have data that is and users that are worldwide, is we are now starting to see companies take notice of privacy issues that they didn't before, and they're starting to realize that we've got personal information stashed inside of that data collection. We need to know and differentiate between what's business related, what's related to specific cases, so we can make sure that that's preserved. And then the last is it starts being able to let us know what we can delete and what we need to retain, what we need to migrate. So if we move forward, on the hold side, what was interesting to us is in our survey was that most of these people are still not using a commercial off-the-shelf product for legal holds. Instead, we see a lot of folks who are still using Excel spreadsheets. And that kind of Excel spreadsheet usage to track things doesn't tie back to the specifics of information usually. It's very difficult. I've walked in with clients who are using spreadsheets and they've got one tab per custodian and they've taken large, they've gone through the effort of actually doing directory lists and pulled those directory lists of the folders and put them into spreadsheets and been able to flag them as relevant, not relevant, otherwise. It's a huge amount of manual labor just to provide a level of insight and defensibility. The technologies are finally catching up to where we can start looking at these data landfills and get some idea about what's there and address them intelligently instead of just tackling them randomly. Let me move forward one more. So beyond the hold side, we then looked and started asking our survey respondents what kinds of technology or are they using technology to support the actual enforcement of the retention policy. What's interesting here is that it really is a question of how large the companies are. Have they invested yet into things that will apply rules, that will apply retention policy based on location of folders? Microsoft is just now in the last 2 releases come out with more practical ways on the email side for retention periods to be placed on Outlook folders. SharePoint is now supporting a lot more using. So we're starting to see these retention policy mechanisms built into the systems, but they don't do you much good if you can't look at your historical legacy existing information and be able to extract out appropriate patterns or groups of documents and types that the legal department, the retention department, and the IT department, and your business users can all use together. You know, in reality, what we're seeing is that even in large companies that have put some kind of retention policy mechanism in place, they are on specific selective systems. Email is the most popular. If you move to the next, we'll be able to show that. And we are seeing what we call corporate records, pretty much are things that users are designating as records. The file shares, it's amazing that only about 30%, about a third of respondents have some kind of active expiry on there. In certain ways, it's because we are seeing the migration off of unstructured file shares over to SharePoint, web repositories, or otherwise. But that's a slow process. And even making that jump is difficult without having an idea of what you've already got there, being able to provide some level of support and direction for the users. Jim, what are the hottest data sources that you guys are seeing interest in this data profiling and inventorying right now?
It's really a lot of the loose files, the stuff that's not managed in those repositories. So, it's the files that are out, that are out in the wild, like, working documents, spreadsheets, PowerPoint. It's just those files that really haven't been put into archives or SharePoint or anything, that they really end up being highly redundant, aging out on the network. So, without any kind of management or policy that's being applied to them, they'll just kind of stagnate out there. So I think a lot of the folks that we're dealing with want to kind of address that stuff, as well as legacy records, even stuff that's on old backup tapes. So I think, if you start backwards and, if you have retention periods that go back maybe 7 years, if you've got data on networks and tapes that, stretches back beyond 10 years, that should be the easiest stuff to deal with, and it's just really clogging up your network. So I think, really aged data, stuff that's not being managed today, could be on backup tapes, could be on networks.
I think it's a challenge, though, that one of the analysis paralysis challenges that we're seeing with clients is that they look at this old data, and the thought of trying to dive in and tackle, 20 terabytes, 50 terabytes of shares as a goal seems too big, and many times there's just resistance to, I don't want to go there. I don't want to force my users to have to wade through that 10 years worth of backup. And what's interesting to me is that the output of the profile reports, being able to extract that out when they look at the legacy data in abstract without having any coherent knowledge about it, then there's resistance. People don't want to move forward on it. When they look at it in specifics, so for instance, you look at that file share and you say, I don't want to look at that. But if I pull it out and say, well, here's every directory in there that has a whole collection of MP3s or has a whole collection of email that we know is redundant to the journal that covers that same time period. Then MIS, counsel, and even the business unit go, oh, okay, well, that's a category that I can now make a decision on because now it's real. It's no longer abstract. The problem is that if you try to go through these systems without technology and wade through them and make sense of the patterns yourself, then it becomes very challenging. I think that's where the technology really comes in. So if we move forward to the next slide, Jan, what we're talking about here is a change in culture. Being able to get more insight into what's there and the behavior patterns so that users feel more comfortable with letting go of the idea of keeping everything. They quit becoming hoarders, and they start moving forward. There are a couple of regulatory changes that have been enacted starting back in 2010 with the Dodd-Frank Act that are going to impact most public corporations. Most public corporations are what are called end users of derivatives or swap trades that they use to hedge risk and debt, and there are new SEC-based and CFTC, or the Commodities Futures Trade Commission-based rules that are going to affect almost all of the U.S. public corporations or global corporations that have a large U.S. presence about visibility into their records on the executive level and the ability for audit committees or risk committees to be able to look into transaction-related records. That may seem a little far afield from this legacy content, but the tools and the techniques are the same. It's all about visibility into the data and being able to see it and manage it. So these new requirements should help push stakeholders to come together and to start looking at the investments that it will take in infrastructure and in process to try to start tackling these things. Fundamentally, there's, the big initiative, the Dodd-Frank Act, the main core focus is transparency. If you're a public corporation and you're a player in the U.S. economy, the government wants you to be able to know what you're doing, see your data, understand the risks you're taking, and that translates over to knowing your data, knowing the information there. All right, Jan, why don't we move to a little more practical approaches here, and let's talk a little bit more about case studies back and forth. So what does that visibility look like, and how does it manifest? Everyone who's run a eDiscovery review or production is reasonably familiar with the capabilities of many of these review platforms to present what we call data facets. That means those lovely search or navigation folders which allow you to sort things out by file type, by custodian, by even potentially by the Active Directory information for your organization, meaning what department were people in, who reported to who, if they've been tagged properly, you can even get physical locations. All of those capabilities were something that were limited to data that had been collected and processed and extracted, indexed up, and put online in a very expensive process. I mean, Jim, we've seen our market go from $2,500 a gigabyte in the 2000 time period all the way down to $300 or so dollars a gigabyte today for processing and review. The problem is that what we haven't seen, there is many players bringing that capability to the data in the wild and in place, so that they're not having to pay a volume-based license fee to tackle what is a large quantity of data they don't even know anything about. At least in the review model, the data that was collected was theoretically data that was potentially relevant to the case, although in many cases all they did was grab all of the custodian data. So what we're looking for in data profiling is insight by these data facets and more on there. Can you give us some examples, Jim, of the other facets that you've seen people leverage in order to make decisions about these about the data that they have?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, I think the difference between eDiscovery data is its value is significant related to a case, so there's a premium of cost. I mean, I think in data profiling it is doing large-scale metadata analysis out there, and some of the analysis around who owns it. Are they a current employee or an ex-employee, an active employee? When was the last access? Is it redundant or duplicated? It's a classic redundant, outdated, trivial, or rot scenario, and how you can use metadata to trigger that. And I think that there's a lot of we talked to the data analysts and those folks that are given this view into it, and there's a traditional data map, which is an interview-based analysis of networks. This is really getting down to allowing technology to extract these these data facets or metadata fields, and then giving it to the data analyst to say, the risk associated with this server because it's being used by the by the marketing department versus the HR department is lower, and so we can classify this thing, this information and kind of profile it that way. So I think the key fields we see is who owns it, the dates like access date or modified date, the location, those kind of things are really critical.
So let's actually dig a tiny bit into that, because we've got some good time here. We want to get specific for users. One of the challenges that I've seen my clients encounter a lot is this identification, simply because on many of these file shares or large unstructured repositories, there are so many network systems that will unintentionally go through and reset or wipe out some of that information. I mean, if I've seen it once, I've seen it 1,000 times where we go in and we say, you know, a custodian says, this is where I keep my data, and we look at it and say, well, it's all owned by domain admin. And turns out that you know, the direct attached storage, you know, the old SCSI controller card was going bad, and they, you know, MIS migrated the data, and suddenly we've got new metadata on it. I know that you guys have tackled that for clients. Why don't you talk a little bit about the use of some of the SIDs and the internal name data that can be pulled out of some of these file types to help supplement?
Yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes organizations do stuff to data that kind of corrupts some of the metadata fields, and I think the most critical one is who owns this. And, you know, if the IT organization does a migration and doesn't do it in a proper way, you get a lot of data that could be owned by admin, or I've seen no one, or I've seen, you know, some other fields that are really have no value. So, you know, the way, you know, what we do is we integrate into Active Directory, which is really the security permissioning scheme, which resolves SIDs of the security IDs that are out there. So, you know, when stuff gets extracted from the network or is not part of that domain, and those SIDs, you know, don't get resolved to the actual username, it becomes complicated. But we can resolve that back. For things that weren't migrated properly, we have the ability to index deeper into the document and, you know, document properties such as owner, which can allow you to decipher some of that information to determine exactly who owns it. So there's a number of things that we do as far as, and we do mapping back too, so you can map back stuff to the original owners and kind of pull it together. So especially if you start going back in time, it gets fairly common. And but there are tools to solve this problem and kind of figure it out and figure out who is the real owner of this document.
Great. I know that we would love to be able to just run those profile reports and make all of our decisions off just purely reports, but it is worth bringing up here that typically you have to actually have some contact or look at exemplars and sample sets of these groups. The reports can help you spot the clusters. They can help you spot the the areas where you can see patterns across type, owner, date, you know, other areas, sources, locations that have moved. But in reality, what the decision makers will need is usually also a certain level of sampling, where they say, okay, you know, we've looked at what we think we've identified a whole branch of non-business content based on these extensions and based on a couple of other properties, and usually either the business owner or the record owner or otherwise is going to want to see some examples. So you have to have that combination of capability, which is, you know, see the big picture and then dive in there and be able to grab specific examples. Second thing I'd like to bring up here is that, you know, when you go into one of these initiatives and you have a goal, whether it's defensible deletion, whether it's a migration, whether it's small specific areas like just getting rid of PSTs or otherwise, one of the techniques that I've seen leveraged fairly well is what we call staged movement or expiry, which is the actions that take place after you've spotted the patterns is first to lock those files into a read-only status so that you've given the users a chance to object, to come back and say, I know we thought that pattern was a good pattern, but I'm finding some stuff I still need here. Then lock them down, where the next stage to take them to a no access where they effectively disappear. They can't see them, but they're still there. You don't have to copy them back before they're finally removed off. So instead of taking a big jump at once and saying we're going to expire everything in this category, it's better to phase them off in a way that gives you a retreat or remediation there. So talking a little bit about the types of initiatives that we've seen in the last 2 years that have really been hitting strong. PST elimination came in probably 4 or 5 years ago, and it really came in with the email archives. So companies had a way to store email offline, no longer just blowing out their mailbox size. They wanted to get rid of those lovely, litigation landmines, the PSTs scattered across the desktop and the network shares and the rest of the user shares. And so they needed they need tools to locate PSTs, to assign identity to those, and then down the road they also need the ability to either import the email directly into the archives or storage, or they need a way for the users to be able to do their own importing of data before they go back and sweep up or delete the PSTs as they exist out there. That was an early need, and we saw tools starting to be shaped, but the network profiling to locate these things has not been so good. I mean, I know, Jim, that one of the filters that you guys have put in place is that one that expands out from just PST to find OSTs, EMLs, and all the other file types that are associated with email, because we don't just see one way that users try to hide or to hoard their communications. I see entire massive network file structures built of users who drag and drop their email out into MSG format out there as well, all of which has to be identified, date range, what kind of rules can we apply to it, how can users now say, yes, I need that, and how do we know when folks are under legal hold that we've managed to get a copy of as it existed before we started that initiative on there. Would you say that email and PST elimination migration is one of the earlier drivers that you've seen, especially off the tape side?
Yeah, definitely off the tape, but PSTs in general are painful, little mini repository. And again, it's the stuff that's unmanaged or the stuff that's in the wild. PSTs are really an example of that, because it's a little repository that someone could make by just dragging content into a folder on their desktop, and suddenly on their desktop they've got a little mini archive that no one in their compliance or policy department knows about. So we've even had customers that have used data profiling to manage PSTs, and I think the big challenge with them is to know where they are, like you said. And we had a company that had a policy in place. They had a pretty painful litigation a couple of years ago, and it involved finding some last-minute evidence which they weren't happy about in a PST container. So it kind of really impacted their legal strategy, because it came in at the very last minute and it surprised them. So they developed a policy with their IT organization to eliminate users from creating PSTs. So they felt that their policies were being implemented, IT locked it down, no PSTs being created. So we did a data profile with them a couple months ago, and the first thing they said is, let's see how the PST policy is being enforced. And in 2 seconds, they went to a chart of looking data by file type, and they found they had over 12,000 PSTs on their networks. And they were like, oh, okay, so we have a problem here, and we need to fix that. So, finding them and knowing that they're there and helping to create a policy to either eliminate them or manage them, or allow users to have them, but just understand what's in them. I've seen all sorts of scenarios around there, but yeah, PSTs are definitely one of the more popular areas around data profiling.
Right. Well, Jim, rather than me kind of walking through all the different case studies and areas that I've seen this profiling leverage, why don't we let you talk about the technology side of it, and I can interject in there some of the case study examples as we go on it.
Yeah, sure. And I think the important thing about data profiling, and one of the points you brought up earlier, Greg, was kind of the analysis paralysis. And I don't blame companies for just getting really overwhelmed about their information governance policies and how to implement them and how to make sure they're being, audit them and so on. It's definitely a lot of work, but I think when you break it down and you start looking at how do we start and how do we move forward with an archiving strategy or a defensible deletion strategy or a litigation readiness strategy, it's, every company that we work with, once we put a data profile in place and start profiling components within their infrastructure, maybe their HR server, maybe their research and development server, the stuff that's obviously high profile and has had repetitive litigation, once they start seeing the data through a data profile, through summary reports, and through this analytical capability, it makes everything else easier because they really start to think about, I can break it down, I can understand this, and understanding what you have is really the first step. And I think that's the important point is, you're not going to pull the trigger on this information governance strategy next week. It's an evolution, and I think the first step is how do you know what you have first? I mean, how do you develop an archiving strategy without knowing what exists? It's tough.
Well, and traditionally, I think one of the barriers to this, Jim, that I've seen many times is, usually on the cutting edge of a discovery request or a internal investigation, the tools that IT has in general to generate these profiles are very limited. I mean, when you've got so many times I've had clients who just send me, MIS has fired off a giant robocopy survey, not a copy, but a robocopy that just pulls all that information, and I get this huge dump that comes through to our team, which then has to put it into SQL, run the grouping, run the scripts, do the full analysis on it, and it's a lot of overhead. And even then, what we hear back is like a client recently was kicking off a migration of data, and just to run the survey that was going to establish, what was the metadata on the start point, what were the file content hash values, and before they even kicked the move off, was 4 days worth of processing. The native file system is not built for this. You've got to leverage the right technology in order to be able to do it in a way that's not a huge burden by itself.
Yeah, and I think one of the themes that we also see out there is the relationship between the IT organization that's trying to support these requests with the tools that they have, and the business units, whether they be compliance or policy or regulatory or eDiscovery folks, is that there's really not a common level of communication. And when you go to the IT organization and say, I need to understand where PSTs are located, or I need to find this kind of data, you get these, robocopy dumps, or you get these things that are just not really that helpful and require you to do a significant amount of work to get what you need. And it's, I think what we've seen is that this data profiling capability or technology is kind of the thread that brings the two organizations together. It allows IT to present information with a usable view that can be analyzed. It allows the business side, the people that need to understand it and manage the data, insight into it that they hadn't had before. So I think the problem before with IT organizations providing not a great support in terms of from eDiscovery to proactive information governance is that they haven't had the tools. But data profiling technology is really introducing these tools, and we'll talk about that a little bit, that allows them to communicate much more effectively. So in terms of the workflow, and the nice thing about this is that it's an easy process to get started. You can start small and grow. We've had customers that started with data profiling projects that are in 1 terabyte or 10 terabytes or 50 terabytes, or you do have some that start up in the hundreds of terabytes or even petabytes. But start small and kind of work within your environment and say, let's just start understanding what this capability offers. And in terms of data profiling, it's a very simple scan. It's a very fast, quick scan using high-speed technology, and you can point to departmental servers. If you've got a lot of harassment lawsuits, the HR department would be a great place to start. If you've got a lot of intellectual property lawsuits, maybe your research and development department and so on. User shares, kind of user junk drawers out there, piles and piles of user data where they save copies of engineering drawings or email or PSTs and things like that. It's kind of a hodgepodge of stuff, of really mystery stuff. Email servers, even legacy backup dates, pick and choose, your targets. And what data profiling is going to do is extract into the searchable database date fields, like last modified, last access, and create a date. And last access is going to give you an indication of, does this have business value? Not that, if no one's accessing it, doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have business value, because people may not know that it exists. But it gives you an indication of, no one's really touched this in 7 years. It's the same idea of, going to the back of your closet and finding those pair of jeans that you haven't worn in 10 years. It's like, that's something you should really be keeping around. So dates are a big field. User, who owns it? who's authored that stuff, location, including file size and where it's located. So that kind of stuff, really rich metadata is populating this data profile. Again, different from a data map, which is going to give you high-level interview-based data. It's going down to the file level, and it's looking at this level of metadata. So it can find PSTs, who owns the PST, when it was last accessed or modified. That's valuable information. And then I'll show some examples that you can combine, queries and filters, and then summary reports that are active reports on this to start making disposition decisions about the data. And we have customers that just go and do the data profiling with these summary reports and don't take any action on the data. What they just want to do is just tell me what I have, let me understand it, and then I can engage in communication and dialogue. Because Greg, you've been dealing in the space for a long, long time, and I think part of the challenge and the frustration we see is the relationship between the IT organization that owns and manages the data and the business side units that need to make decisions about the content, that the dialogue isn't as strong and isn't as powerful as it needs to be.
Well, it's not just as strong as powerful. There's many times they're moving it towards different goals. For example, IT sees the need to clean up these old data stores because they're essentially they're the owners now. They're the ones who are keeping these very large infrastructure storage areas full of this data, whereas to the user, they don't care about it. In fact, they need old data occasionally, very occasionally, to find a piece of information to get their job done. One of the meeting points between these two that I've seen play out a lot recently is new data creation. We're moving to a new system. We're moving to SharePoint. We're moving to a managed, to email retention folders, email retention categories, and leveraging those old patterns so that they can use that as the basis for creation of rules to help dispose of even new content. I've seen companies that say, I don't want to go back and clean up that old data because I've got way too many large litigation cases. I've got way too many courts looking over my shoulder, or I'm a regulated company and the weeding of data is just too scary. But what they do want to do is stop the accumulation, is slow the accumulation down. So I don't want to necessarily go back and have to triage all this old stuff, but what they can see with the profiling is that the report can give them categories and information which are the foundation with how to start controlling the new data that accumulates.
Right.
So,
exactly.
And the trick to that is policy, matching up policy to pattern and matching up the category that something falls in a way that makes sense. We've got a good number of categories here, and I believe we've got a follow-up piece for attendees that's got some example categories that we put together that are about 50 different ones that give you some idea about what some of the patterns we've seen in prior engagements along this line.
Yeah, and I think, we were talking about classification of data, it's kind of how you put it into these buckets. And, if you think about data, stuff that, for example, if you classify it as abandoned data. So what could be abandoned data? And, your definition may vary, whereas, it's owned by an ex-employee and no one has been accessing that in years. And it could be duplicates, so it could be one of 150 copies that exist out there owned by an ex-employee and no one's touched it in 10 years. So is that the classification of abandoned? And I think, if you classify stuff as all this stuff is abandoned data on the network, what is our policy towards abandoned data, and having a conversation about that. Age data is also another one that's very popular, and that's really just triggering off the access date. And organizations think of age data as stuff that hasn't been accessed in 2 or 3 years. But you got stuff on your network that hasn't been accessed in 7 to 10 years.
Well, Jim, I think there's a really good point there when you talk about aged, or what I call aged or inactive data versus your last classification there, which is active. One of the first points that I see customers struggle with is what is our basic business life cycle for data? How long do users typically need to access data and be able to retrieve information before we can reasonably safely classify it as inactive? What's our basic retention period? And that's one of the easiest things to get off these file shares, because if you just do a chronological breakdown, based on that last access date, you can see the curve of it's being accessed, now it falls off after 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. And you can see, especially if you can break that down by business unit or even by file type, which gets a little more granular because there are always going to be some, exceptions to the generality rule. So that's one of the fast benefits right off the bat for doing that data profile is tell us what per business unit, per location, per file type, whatever, what is our active time period across this area versus what is our inactive.
Yeah, exactly, and it's really important to look at it based on the business owner, because if you can go, one of the important points is, we integrate into Active Directory, as I mentioned, so that says everyone that's in the marketing group, for example, let's talk about the age of their data. Once it hits 2 years, that becomes, if it hasn't been accessed in 2 years, that becomes inactive, and we may want to move it offline or to cheaper storage just to get it off the network. If someone's in research and development, age for them is maybe beyond 7 years. If they haven't been touched in 7 years. And there's also the value in data profiling is to mine that stuff, is to say, you know what, there's research that was created 5 years ago that I'm trying to find that you can use data profiling to find. So I think looking for dark data and mining for that and leveraging it. But I think active versus inactive by departments and developing policies around it. And these are some examples of, these are not necessarily policies, but classification buckets that you can put in there. And I think, a lot of things like the redundant or duplicate content, personal content. We have customers that have, employees coming back from vacation and putting their photos online to share with other people. Some employees downloading movies off of BitTorrent and having, every episode of Star Wars out there, every Star Wars movie out there. So that stuff just takes up space, and there's also risk, and copyright risk in there. They really don't want to have that stuff out there. So, the stuff here is really stuff that companies can make decisions about and manage it. And some of it is just cleaning up storage space and reclaiming storage space. Some of it is just getting rid of stuff that could be potential risk, because as data ages, it loses context, and if there's litigation around it and the context is gone, that's kind of a scary proposition. If it's a working document for a product that was never manufactured, and people will misconstrue it, I mean, that's not going to be something that you really want to keep out there.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen examples recently of even public data collections that have had an awful lot of the PII, or personally identifiable information, stashed in it that nobody even realized.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that we're seeing happening a lot. I mean,
happens all the time. I mean, I think one of the questions that did come up was asking if we had the ability to scan documents for PI. So I think, for us, data profiling goes at 2 levels. It's a metadata level, which is really the high-level information about files and documents and emails. So at a metadata level for email, it's going to give you the container, the PST, the EDB, the NSF container. Full content data profiling will go inside and look at all the content. So in that case, it'll look inside emails and attachments. It'll look inside PDFs. And it can scan, in that case, for PI or personally identifiable information like Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, and find that. And if the documents, the question was specific about if you've got PDFs that are non-text-based PDFs that were scans, there is an OCR engine that can convert that to text. So I think with data profiling, you can go as light or as deep of a touch as you want. And if you're managing things like risk, where PII and content is important, you're going to go deeper into that, into it and do full text data profiling.
Yeah, although I would say, Jim, that the typical scenario that I see play out that works is where specific, use the high-level data profile to pick your full text areas for more detailed sampling almost, or for more detailed selection, or if you already know you have to do an eDiscovery collection, use that to test more detailed information about your policies. The full enterprise index is one of those things that a lot of companies have promised for years, and we see it very seldom does it actually play out very well in the large enterprise world.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of these classifications, I mean, that's kind of like boiling the ocean, right? So you can use the metadata to really clean up a significant portion. And here's a quick case study that one of our clients that was actually in the energy markets down in Houston had a 100 terabyte server. So how much data, how many pages of documents are on 100 terabytes? It's a massive volume of data. It's just been sitting there, and it's a combination of all this stuff: abandoned, age, redundant, personal content, risk content, active content. So he went through there and cleaned it up, using data profiling, and he found out that 35% of it or so was duplicate content, which he cleaned up. And he went and found the age content that wasn't accessed. He found the personal content that was just junk. He had 20 terabytes of junk on there. 20% of it was just garbage, and based on his policy. So he ended up cleaning that down to about 20 terabytes, from 100 terabytes down to 20 terabytes. And then when you're doing that, it's really only 20% of what you originally started with. It makes these tasks a lot easier. So I mean, I think, cleaning up the all the garbage, and then starting to do some really value-based archiving and value-based retention is much easier than trying to do it across the entire environment. So I mean, we're running short on time here. It's a good topic. I guess we need to expand our time for these things. But some of the rich metadata fields, allow you to query things like, what hasn't been accessed in 7 years. Pretty common and popular query. Where is data owned by ex-employees? An employee leaves an organization and you wipe out their desktop or their laptop. What about all the stuff they own that they put on file shares and networks and all that stuff that's out there? That just sits there and becomes abandoned data. Where's John Doe's email? Again, Greg mentioned earlier, you save an email on a desktop, it becomes an EML file. You save a PST on a server. Where are all those locations? So data profiling is a very powerful tool to tell you where that stuff is. IT departments love data profiling. So it's like, why am I archiving data onto backup tapes that's more than 10 years old or hasn't been accessed in 10 years? So it helps the IT organization. And in working and collaborating with your IT organization, if there's something in it for them to be able to streamline their operations and clean stuff up, it just makes collaboration a lot more successful. How much duplicate data is there in data profiling? Can create document signatures using MD5 hashes of the content so that you can determine if it's a duplicate or not. You can also look at the queries as well, so you can look at do PII audits, so find stuff that has social security numbers and credit card numbers that are out there on the network, and that's using a full content data profile. Where are the PSTs, what data on this user share, who owns the stuff on the user shares. Another case study we did with a financial services organization where they did a data profile, proof of concept really, on a 10 terabyte server. They found out that the top 3 owners by capacity of content on there are all ex-employees. They don't exist anymore. They don't work in the organization any longer. For them, that was an instant revelation. They're like, wow, we had no idea that most of the bulk of the content is owned by someone that doesn't even exist anymore within the organization. So different levels of metadata and profiling queries that can be done. And I'll go through it pretty quickly. Some reports that are done. I mean, typically people are doing age data profiles or ex-employee data profiles or looking for multimedia. So it really is, doing a filter, which could be, say, by owner name or a specific server like HR, generating a summary report, which could be last access greater than 7 years, or owner and capacity reports, and then taking different disposition actions here. Whether it be transition it to a different location like a cloud, deleting it, so that's defensible deletion, archiving it, even just notifying, if it's multimedia files, notifying their management saying that, you know what, you got a bunch of people in your department that are storing lots of multimedia files, so you may want to check into that. Encrypting it, if you got HIPAA regulations and sensitive data needs to be encrypted. So the actions are your own. It's really data profiling provides the insight and policy that allows you to make the decisions about the content. Quick workflow here, so you can see here you can specify specific locations on the network, get a summary report. This is last modified time by file count. You can see here that 42% of this content hasn't been modified in more than 5 years. The reports are active in the data profile, so you can just say, hey, I only want to select just the 5-year or greater report, so it'll filter down there, and then you can kick into another report and say, who owns that stuff that hasn't been active accessed in more than 5 years, and you find that 63% is owned by this one employee who may or may not be a current employee. So that's stuff you can use to make decisions, have intelligent conversations about the data. Disposition options within the interface. There's a delete button. There's an extract button, which will move it to a different location. But if you just want to do defensible deletion, the delete button is there. All audit logs are in the product, so you have a history of who did the deletion, when it was done, what was deleted, and those logs are in there and maintained within the product, so you have that defensible deletion capability. You can also extract specific paths of the files and file names, so you can use third-party tools to do things like encryption and other management of the data. So, here we're wrapping up. I know there's been a few questions. If we didn't get to you today, we'll get back to you one-on-one. But I think, what we're talking about today is the capability of data profiling that really provides that level of knowledge to understand data, and as simple as finding, redundant, outdated, and trivial data, finding data of value and moving it to an archive for supporting legal and compliance, and really doing a lot of cleanup and improved management based on policy, or even helping to refine your policy. And I think some of the, before we have a couple white papers and some content that we wanted to offer you as part of attending this session, to give you an idea that it's easy to get started. I mean, you can really start small with data profiling. At $1,000 per terabyte, you can do a metadata profile of content to help make decisions about it. There's also a cloud lab that we have as well that you can send a recent backup tapes. So we have customers that send a backup, 20 backup tapes of a number of servers, and for $150 a tape, we can create a data profile and kick that out to you as a report saying, here's the profile of that content. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach it. Most customers start small and then grow from there to understand a better idea of the content. And as Greg mentioned, if you're interested in getting in touch with us directly, Greg's email is there, as is mine. There's a classification report that's got a lot of different classification buckets that EDJ Group has put together through their many years of expert consulting out there in the market. We also have a white paper about achieving effective information governance through data profiling. There's a lot of information out there. If you reach out to us, we'd be happy to engage in dialogue with you and handhold you through this process and explain exactly how it works. So I know, Greg, we're pretty much at the end. Do you have some words of wisdom to leave with?
The only wrap-up that I would have here is to put some of this back into context is that tackling these old, large repositories of legacy or existing data or implementing of new retention systems can feel like an overwhelming task. It can really, if you look at the big picture of it, it can really frighten folks off. But the trick is to be able to make informed decisions, have the right information that arms you, and Jim, you were hitting the right button there by saying, start small. Don't try to get in there and say, like classic example is of clients who go in there and say, well, we want to first identify all the records. Well, the answer to that may be no. Don't start with identifying all the records. Instead, use a profile, use some techniques to identify the easy-to-classify groups of data that you don't need. Sometimes if you're only looking at, if you can classify by large process, 50, 60, 70% of the data, then maybe it's not necessary to go in there and try to apply, 6, 8, 10, unfortunately I've seen hundreds of records retentions to the remaining portion that's left. Instead, it may be more important to just simply define your goals. Is it to control growth? Is it to slow down the cost of litigation? Is it to simply have visibility so you know where your data is so that you reduce risk? Define that goal, set some achievable process to it instead of trying to tackle the whole world of it, and to know your data so you can manage it. That's the first step. That's my big picture on the whole profiling issue. You've got to let the data talk to you. Don't try to apply your assumptions to the data.
Yeah, and leverage technology there, because it's really there going to help you to do the heavy lifting and help you get a good view into what you have. And then, then start tackling it bit by bit, but it's a good way to start, and I think that's a good way to end. I appreciate everybody's time today. If you want a copy of the presentation or any of these papers, reach out to either Greg or myself, and we will get that back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Greg. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and to have you participate in our webinars.
Thank you, and thanks for the audience. I hope you all got some good information out of it, and then reach out to either one of us if you need any further support. Thank you.